Hey guys, we're back today with another video in our tanking series, and today, as promised, we're covering the Brewmaster Monk. So let's start off as we always do, just talking about how the Brewmaster tanks damage. So the Brewmaster Monk, unlike the Prot Warrior and Prot Paladin, and unlike the Blood DK, does not have any ways to actively mitigate the damage that we're taking up front, right? We don't have shield block ability, we don't have Shield of the Righteous, etc. The Brewmaster Monk's whole tanking mechanic, the way that they reduce their damage, is from a passive ability called Stagger. So let's go over what Stagger is. We'll read together. As you can see, you shrug off attacks, delaying a portion of physical damage taken based on your agility, instead taking it over 10 seconds. This also affects magical attacks at 35% effectiveness. Let's talk about what that means. So if you open your character frame, assuming that you have a monk, you will see one of the stats listed under your attributes is Stagger. So for my Brewmaster Monk, I just copied this over to the PTR, by the way. You can see the stat squish, level 50, item level 102. It's still so weird to see. But my current gear level, it's equivalent basically to the BFA item level 445, somewhere around there. So my current stagger level is 41%. So I'm staggering just passively. I'm staggering 40% of the damage that I'm taking. So stagger means that instead of taking all of the damage up front, whatever damage it is, I'm only taking 60% of it up front, and the other 40% is being staggered. And what stagger means is that it takes that damage and turns it into a damage over time effect. And you'll see an icon for it here when I start fighting enemies. But it basically just turns that damage into a dot. So that's what stagger is. That's the easiest way to think about it, is we'll take a number like 1,000, okay, since we've all been squished to oblivion. Okay, so we'll take a number like 1,000. If I was going to get hit for 1,000 damage, instead of taking that entire 1,000 damage straight to the dome, I instead only take 600 of that 1,000 damage straight to the dome, and the other 400 damage, since I'm at 40% stagger, would be rolled into a dot that just ticks on me over 10 seconds, okay? So that's the stagger mechanic, right? All the damage you're taking, whatever your stagger is at, just gets rolled into a dot, and you take it over 10 seconds. That's the basic fundamental mechanic, okay? Now let's talk about how we can smooth out that damage taking so that we're not just being killed by the dot. So first off to talk about is one of the changes in Shadowlands is that we no longer have Ironskin Brew, we only have Purifying Brew. So Ironskin Brew has been baked into a passive talent. For those of you who are not familiar with monks, Ironskin Brew was an ability that we could use. It was a brew on our action bar, just like this, that we could hit that would delay our stagger even further. So effectively what that means is instead of having this dot up here ticking down over 10 seconds, it would instead delay the damage even further, so that it's no longer ticking over 10 seconds, it's ticking over 12 seconds or 14 seconds or whatever. You understand? So instead of taking, you know, let's say that 400 damage over 10 seconds, I could have hit Ironskin Brew and taken that 400 damage over 14 seconds, and now it's a much smaller damage tick that I'm taking every second that that dot is active. And that's what Ironskin Brew did, is it just delayed the stagger even further. That has been baked into a passive that we now have in Shadowlands called Shuffle. So what this does is it just basically automatically gives you that stagger, that Ironskin Brew effect every time you use your Keg Smash ability, your Blackout Kick ability, or your Spinning Crane Kick ability. It just does the exact same thing, increases the effectiveness of your stagger by 100%. It's very similar to what Ironskin Brew did, and it just does that passively now. So instead of having to constantly hit Ironskin Brew and take up a global just to do that, you now can just passively get that effect of Ironskin Brew by hitting enemies with your normal rotational abilities. Okay, so that's the important thing to know about how we can further smooth out the damage that we're taking in that constant sort of ticking dot damage. Let's talk about another way that we have in our toolkit, which is Purifying Brew. It's arguably one of the most important kind of damage mitigation abilities that we have as a monk. And what Purifying Brew does is it just straight up clears 50% of the damage that we have being delayed with stagger. It has some interaction with Celestial Brew that we'll get to in a second, but I want to kind of hammer this point home. Purifying Brew, if we go back to that 400 number that we were using a second ago, right? So I was going to get hit for 1,000 damage. I instead only got hit for 600 damage, and the other 400 damage got turned into a dot. You'll see a little buff up here on yourself. It got turned into a dot that's ticking down over 10 seconds. That's the baseline amount of time, okay? Let's say that I keep getting hit for more 1,000 damage kind of profile numbers, and each time another 400 damage is being added into my stagger pool, and I eventually get to the point where I'm like, holy cow, this is too much dot damage that I'm taking. It's starting to really freaking hurt. I can hit Purifying Brew, and it will just straight up remove 50% of that damage. So if I had a grand total of, let's say, 1,000 damage banked up here, in my stagger mechanic that's ticking down as a dot, there was 1,000 damage built up there. I could hit Purifying Brew, and I now only have 500 damage that's being delayed with stagger as a dot over 10 seconds. So you start to see, as you're doing more and more difficult content, how this is super powerful, right? As we scale in gear and we scale in stats, since stagger is based off of our agility, right? You can imagine how, as we scale and get better gear and things like that, we're delaying more and more damage, a higher percentage of damage anyways with stagger, and that means that we can get to a point where we have a very smooth damage profile. What this also means, though, the downside of that is that if you're not very well geared or optimized, and certainly probably at the beginning of expansions, you will feel incredibly squishy. And I should take this time now probably to say that this is not really the ideal kind of solo tank to just go out running around in the world, right? If you want something that's very independent and self-sufficient and not reliant on a healer, you want something like a Blood Death Knight or a Prop Paladin or something like that that has some self-heals. The Brewmaster Monk is not it. We have almost no self-heals. We do have some, but they're very, very small. So that's the important thing to know. Certainly when you're doing dungeons, like Mythic Plus content, even heroic dungeons, you will definitely feel the damage that you're taking from this ticking dot that's on you just constantly, right? It lasts for 10 seconds, so it's not literally constantly. It will eventually fall off, assuming that you stop taking damage. But every instance that you take more damage, it will just add to that dot. So if your dot was ticking down and you had 4 seconds left and then you took another hit, it now goes right back up to 10 seconds. Okay, so in dungeons and things like that, you definitely need to be babysat by a healer, and that's why you don't see a lot of Brewmaster Monks in Mythic Plus content. But you do see a lot of them in raids, and that's because obviously being able to avoid being hit for some monstrously enormous amount and instead taking it over a fairly manageable damage over time effect is very good for raids where things are a lot more scary and serious. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys, and I'm just going to go over it one more time so it's a little clear. We do not take all of the damage that we would normally have taken up front, right? So where the warrior would have gotten hit for, you know, he was going to get hit for 100k, let's say it was a melee attack, and instead he used his shield block, right? And shield block just straight up reduces the damage that you take from melee damage, so he's just straight up taking less damage from that attack, but he still has to eat the damage that does come through, right? Whatever that amount is. The Brewmaster Monk is different, right? Some amount of damage will still come through to our face, which is why stats are so important, right? Because stagger scales off of agility. So some amount of damage will still come through to our face, but the majority of it, hopefully, once we have some gear, is just turned into a damage over time effect that ticks down slowly over 10 seconds. And this is the key thing, right? And we have a lot of ways, as we go through the toolkit, you'll see, we have a lot of ways, we have a lot of options with our talents and different things like that to either continue delaying the stagger that we're taking, right? So that it's a longer dot and we're not taking so much damage per tick. And we have a lot of ways to just straight up remove some of the stagger damage that we have stored up. So Purifying Brew is very important for that reason. We just straight up remove 50% of the damage. We just cheated, right? Instead of getting hit for 1,000 damage and having 400 of it turn into a dot, we now effectively only have 200 of it in a dot because we cleared it with Purifying Brew, which then effectively means we didn't actually get hit for 1,000 damage at all. We only got hit for 800, right? So that's Purifying Brew. It's very powerful when you use it correctly, right? Also, you will see the green cooldown time in the corner where it says 14 seconds. That scales off of haste, right? So anytime you see a green cooldown time for your abilities, that's how you know they scale off haste. So you can get this cooldown time down pretty low, although there is sort of a cap on haste for Brewmaster Monks. But anyways, let's talk about the second part of Purifying Brew. Increases the absorption of your next Celestial Brew, which is a new ability we have in Shadowlands, by up to 200% based on your current level of Stagger. So keep that in mind, and then let's go over what Celestial Brew is. Celestial Brew is an ability that we're getting in Shadowlands, like I said, that's normally on a 1-minute cooldown. And essentially this is an absorption shield, like Guard in Legion. It's kind of similar. So at a baseline, it absorbs a very negligible amount of damage. It's really not worth casting, in my opinion. If you're just going to use it for its baseline absorption shield, it's such a small number. And it's on a very long cooldown, by the way, so it would just be incredibly inefficient to do that. What you want to do is get a really big fat Celestial Brew shield, and the way that you do that is by purifying off a very large amount of Stagger, right? So remember, this increases the absorption of your next Celestial Brew by up to 200% based on your current level of Stagger, right? So whatever your Stagger level is at, when you hit this ability, if you let it go from like the Stagger, by the way, so you guys know in the base UI anyways, which I don't recommend using, but just so you know, there will be a little icon up here. When you first start taking damage and your Stagger dot starts rolling, it will be green, the color green. It will be a little circle that's green, and that will let you know that the game thinks that your current level of Stagger is just fine. It's manageable. Then if you start taking more damage and the dot starts really stacking up, it will turn from the color green to the color yellow, the little circle here. And that's the game letting you, it's the game giving you a kind of warning that you're taking a lot of dot damage now. And it would be my opinion that it's when it's in that sort of yellow zone that you want to use Purifying Brew. I think waiting until it goes to red, which is the final color, which means you might die from the dots, might be a little too late, but I will leave that up to you guys to decide. But basically what you want to do is remove as much Stagger damage as you possibly can with your Purifying Brew so that you have a really, really enormous Celestial Brew damage absorption shield. I have seen these shields get ridiculously large. Just to put into context for you guys, the base amount that it absorbs right now, based on my stats and things like that, it absorbs 4,600 damage, essentially, right? To put that into context, I don't know if you guys can see or not, I have 23,400 HP currently on the PTR, right? So this absorbs approximately 1/4 of, you know, my total HP bar. That's the damage absorption it's going to give me. When I was just like fucking around on the PTR earlier today, I was running this dungeon, Shrine of Storms, and I was just in here solo doing some stuff, and I let my Stagger get up to a pretty high, pretty scary level, and I thought I was going to die. And I purified it off, and then I immediately Celestial Brewed, and the damage absorption shield that I got from this was 24,000. It was worth 24,000 damage. It was literally a little more than my entire HP bar was the shield that I got from this because I waited that long. Now, whether it's recommended to always wait that long is something to be debated, but the key thing that I'm trying to say here is don't just like panic and be constantly purifying off the Stagger damage that you're taking. It's not really necessary. We have some other ways to help smooth things out for ourselves. This is a class that's just going to take damage, right? So if you're kind of an OCD person and that's just going to bug you that you can't keep yourself at full health, then like, man, this is not the tank for you because you're going to be constantly taking ticking damage while you're fighting enemies. And there's nothing you can do about that. So while Purifying Brew is very powerful and will clear 50% of the damage you have stored in here, it's also important to know that, like I said, this is not a solo content tank. You're going to be running in Mythic Plus if you're pretty ballsy, or you're going to be probably in raids and things like that. And in that case, you're going to have dedicated healers to help keep you up. I will say that something like a Resto Druid just throwing on a Rejuve and a Life Bloom is more than enough to heal through your Stagger damage all the way from green up until yellow when they have to start actually spamming heals. So just so you guys get an idea, don't panic just because you see your health dipping a little low. Your health is going to be all over the place, and it's fine. I promise. It's fine. So try and delay your Stagger, you know, purifying it off as much as you can. Try and control yourself and let that Stagger amount get a little high so that you can purify it off and then have a really massive Celestial Brew shield, is what I'm trying to say. So let's get into some of the ways we have to self-heal or stabilize, things like that outside of Purifying Brew, right? And outside of Celestial Brew, which again is that giant Absorption shield. So expel harm while you're fighting enemies and different things like that. You'll occasionally get these little yellow healing spheres that will pop on the ground. That's from one of our passives. Anytime you take damage, you have a chance to summon one. It's just this little yellow kind of glowing ball on the ground here that you can either walk through that will heal you for a small amount, or you can press expel harm and it will just draw all of those healing spheres over to you to heal you. Okay, you have the monk's kind of baseline spell Vivify that you can use to cast on yourself and heal yourself. It's a very small heal, I will say, but it is still a heal. It is still something that you can use to help keep yourself alive if you're worried about that. And then, of course, you have the baseline monk defensive ability called Fortifying Brew. This is on an obnoxiously long, in my opinion, 7-minute cooldown, but it does do a lot of things, right? It lasts for 15 seconds. It increases your max HP by 20%. It increases the effectiveness of your stagger by 10%, and it reduces all damage you take by 20%. So it does a lot, and it's very powerful, but it's on a 7-minute cooldown. So outside of that, we have Zen Meditation, reduces all damage you take by 60% for 8 seconds. This is on a 5-minute cooldown. You have to be channeled while you're casting it. And if you're hit by a melee attack or do anything with your character at all, basically it's cancelled. So that kind of sucks. It's basically never used except for in some very niche raid situations. So that's really it for your defensive kit. To be honest, you can talent into some defensive options like Dampen Harm. We'll go over that stuff in the talents though. So now that we've gone through how we tank damage and mitigate damage, let's talk about the rest of our toolkit. Okay, so Tiger Palm is your bog standard, just basic attack. It costs 25 energy, which is our main resource system here. And you just hit an enemy for however much damage. Importantly, it reduces the remaining cooldown on your brews by 1 second. So this counts for both your Purifying Brew, which can already be reduced by haste, the cooldown time of it, and it also takes 1 second off of your Celestial Brew. So that's pretty important to keep in mind. Moving on then, we have Blackout Kick, which is on a 4-second cooldown. This is not affected by haste. This is a slightly harder hitting single target ability and grants you Shuffle for 3 seconds. So if you remember, we talked about Shuffle is the new passive ability that just baked in the Iron Skin Brew effect, right? So increases the effectiveness of your stagger by 100% anytime you hit an enemy with Keg Smash, which we'll go over in a second, or with Blackout Kick, or with Spinning Crane Kick, right? You get this just passive shuffle effect, which is the Iron Skin Brew baked in, basically, right? So your stagger is delayed and its effectiveness is increased, okay? So just keep that in mind. This is one of the ways, what I'm trying to say, this is one of the ways that you can help smooth out some of the damage that you're taking, right? Instead of just panic button smashing your Purifying Brew, instead just take a second, hit a couple of enemies with Blackout Kick, with Keg Smash, with Spinning Crane Kick, right? Start getting that Iron Skin Brew passive ability baked in to help reduce some of the damage you're taking and smooth it out a little bit. Okay, so that's, again, that's Blackout Kick. Keg Smash is an ability that costs 40 energy. It's very expensive. It's on a 7-second cooldown. Again, this is affected by haste. It does some pretty nice AoE damage to all enemies within 8 yards, reduces their movement speed by 20%, and grants Shuffle, again, for 5 seconds, and also reduces the remaining cooldown on your brews by 3 seconds. So already you're seeing this reduces the remaining cooldown in your brews by 1 second, this reduces the remaining cooldown in your brews by 3 seconds, etc., etc. Again, these are your brews. Purifying Brew, which you have 2 charges of, and your Celestial Brew, which there's a talent, again, that you can reduce the cooldown of this. So hopefully you're starting to see you don't have to panic and just immediately use your Purifying Brew to get rid of the dot. You have ways to delay the damage and smooth out the damage just already in your rotation with your Blackout Kick and your Keg Smash. So now that we've talked about Keg Smash, let's go over Breath of Fire. These two are used together. Breath of Fire is on a 15-second cooldown. It does some AoE damage, fire damage to enemies in front of you, and any targets that you hit with your Keg Smash will be affected, basically they take a dot. Sorry, I'm like getting all mixed up here. If you hit enemies with Cake Smash and then immediately hit them with Breath of Fire, basically they take extra fire damage, and importantly they deal 5% reduced damage to you for 12 seconds. So again, this is one of the ways that we can just help kind of actively reduce the damage that we're taking in. Okay, so that's Breath of Fire. Every 15 seconds you can go up to a whole fresh pack of mobs, or the same pack of mobs that you're fighting, whatever the case may be, hit them with Cake Smash, and then hit them with Breath of Fire, and you're just taking 5% reduced damage from all of those mobs for 12 seconds, which is very nice. Spinning Crane Kick is an ability that we got back in Shadowlands that's going to be baseline for us. This costs 25 energy, and this just does some AoE damage. Doesn't do anything else special. It does grant you that passive shuffle effect again, like we saw in the spellbook. But basically, this is what we're going to be using to grab snap AoE threat on mobs in dungeons instead of having to take the other stupid talent that we used to have to take. So that's nice. Touch of Death is something we're getting back. Also baseline for all monk specs, I believe, but certainly for this one, for Brewmaster Monk, we're getting it back. It's on a 3-minute cooldown, so you don't want to use this willy-nilly. It basically just insta-kills anything that has less health than you. It does say that if you're trying to use this against stronger creatures, like creatures that are stronger than you, so I assume like, you know, elite dungeon mobs and stuff like that, they have to be under 15% health. However, if you use it on like regular mobs like this in the dungeon, you can for sure just one-shot them. I've tested it a number of times and it works. So just so you know, that's that. We do have a dispel effect called Detox on an 8-second cooldown. It costs 20 energy to use, which I think just sucks massive balls because Blizzard hates us. This removes all poison and disease effects from the target. There are not a ton of creatures in the game, obviously, that are going to just go around poisoning you and putting diseases on you and stuff, obviously. However, it is kind of nice to just have some of this added utility. Outside of that, we have our baseline interrupt again. Like I've said a number of times, every tank in the game has an interrupt. Ours is called Spear Hand Strike on a 15-second cooldown, and it just interrupts casts. Leg Sweep is our baseline stun. This is an AoE stun, which is very nice. On a 1-minute cooldown, just stuns all enemies in 6 yards for 3 seconds. Paralysis is our another CC ability. It basically just incapacitates the target for 1 minute if you do any kind of damage to them, though the CC effect is broken. So that's that. That's our taunt. Basic stuff. We can do things like port back to our little panda home. Who cares? Transcendence mostly is used in PvP or maybe in raid environments. You can just leave a copy of yourself and portal back to it. So yeah, you might use it in some raids if there's heavy movement required, but I feel like mostly Transcendence is used in PvP. We do, of course, have a resurrection spell since we're Trinity class and we have a healer available to us, but it's not a battle res, so that's the only important thing to know about that. So now let's talk about our baseline damage cooldown. This is something, again, that we're getting in Shadowlands. It is called Invoke Nyazu, however you want to pronounce that, the Black Ox. We're just going to call him Ox from now on. It's on a 3-minute cooldown. And basically, you summon this Ox, and he runs around doing some AoE damage. He lasts for 25 seconds. The important thing about this ability is that while this Ox is running around for those 25 seconds, 25% of the damage that you have being delayed by Stagger is instead taken by Nyazu. So remember that stagger bar we were talking about up here, this little ball of green light or yellow light or whatever color it happens to be. While he's active, 25% of that damage is instead taken as a dot by him, which is great. It's just it's a neat damage ability, but also kind of a defensive thing baked into it, which I think is cool. So that's pretty much our baseline toolkit, everything that I'm going to cover anyways. Let's go hop into talents real quick. Not a whole lot has changed for Shadowlands. We do have like some kind of changes here and there, but I'm mostly only going to cover the things that are most commonly taken. So Eye of the Tiger, this just does a dot every time you use Tiger Palm. It puts a dot on enemies and provides you with a small amount of healing over 8 seconds. It's really not a big deal. It's just some added damage. If you're having trouble healing yourself, you can take Chi Wave or Chi Burst. They both provide some small heals also. This is our mobility row. Feel free to take whatever you want based on the content that you're doing. Most people take Chi Torpedo, but there's an argument for Tiger Celeste. Take whatever you want. For level 30, all of these have like some arguments that can be made for them. However, with the way that things have changed in terms of not having Iron Skin Brew as a button we can press and things like that, everybody that I'm seeing is taking light brewing, and I'm testing it myself, and it feels great. It basically just reduces the cooldown of your purifying brew and your celestial brew by 20%, which is enormous, I feel like. So yeah, it just reduces the cooldown flat out. Remember I said this is supposed to be a 1 minute cooldown at baseline. You can reduce it down to 48 seconds right off the bat with your light brewing. And remember also that your Tiger Palm and your Keg Smash also reduces the cooldown on your brews. So I think you can get this down pretty easily and realistically to somewhere around 32, 34 seconds maybe, which would feel a lot better, I think. So yeah, having the cooldown reduction I think is much better than either of these two. 25% chance to reset Breath of Fire, who freaking cares? Black Ox Brew is what we used to take BFA in previous expansions to just get all of our energy back, all of our brew charges back, things like that. However, it's on a 2 minute cooldown. And with the way Celestial Brew works, ordinarily being on a 1 minute cooldown, it just works out that you have it up faster and more frequently by just taking light brewing. So that's that. This is all CC ability, our level 35 tier. Take whatever you want to take, basically. A wider range of your stun and shorter CC. If you want to do solo world content, take Black Ox statue so you can taunt all the things. Take Ring of Peace if you're going to do Mythic Plus content. This just puts this giant bubble down that kind of knocks enemies away from it, right? It acts like a giant rubber shield where if they try to run into it, they just bounce off. So that's Ring of Peace. Very good in Mythic Plus, by the way, to like knock mobs out of sanguine pools and things like that. This is a defensive talent line. So if you want an actual button that you can press to deal with a mechanic that you know is coming in a particular dungeon or raid, you can take Dampen Harm on a 2 minute cooldown. At a baseline, it reduces 20% damage for 10 seconds. However, it can scale all the way up to 50% damage reduction if you're going to take a really, really big hit. So I like this ability a lot. If you feel like you're dying a little too quickly and you want some more self-healing, some more self-sustain, you can take Healing Elixir. It's pretty nice 30-second cooldown with 2 charges. Heals you for 15% of your max HP. Bob and Weave is a passive that just increases the duration of your stagger by 3 seconds. This is also quite powerful, I'm not going to lie, just having a flat 3-second increase. So instead of it being 10 seconds, right, that the dot is ticking for, it's 13 seconds. That obviously means you're taking less damage per tick, which can really help smooth out the damage intake. So kind of make your own decision here based on how you feel playing the Brewmaster Monk. So far, there's no real clear winner between Dampen Harm. This is probably more situational, whereas this is more universal. Like just universally, you're always going to be safe taking Bob and Weave. Next up is the damage row. Again, Special Delivery has just been nerfed to holy heaven in the last 1.5 million years, so I don't know. Drinking from your brews, every time you drink from your brews, basically you toss a keg into the air, it deals some AoE damage and reduces their movement speed by 50%. Yay. So it's like, I don't know. The thing is that now that we only have 2 different kinds of brews, one that's on a 1 minute cooldown, and one that's very important and we have to conserve and be very smart with, we're not just going to be popping brews all the time the way that we used to be able to do, right? So Special Delivery has just been nerfed in a bunch of ways, namely that. Rushing Jadewind is what we used to take to have an AoE option for grabbing Snap Threat in dungeons. However, like I said, we now have Spinning Crane Kick baseline, so we don't have to take this. If you just want to do a crap ton of AoE damage in dungeons and stuff, then you can feel free to take this. I think Exploding Keg is a little better, and it's what I've been running, and it feels really good. So this is a 1 minute damage cooldown. It deals a very significant amount of fire damage to all enemies, AoE ability, and causes them to miss their next melee attacks for the next 3 seconds. So it's a pretty helpful passive effect in making them miss their melee attacks, but really it just does a crap ton of damage, frankly. On this row, I feel like currently right now in the PTR, High Tolerance is really the only option here. The rest of these are just kind of meh, to be honest. High Tolerance is just universally good. It's going to be a safe go-to option. So Stagger is 5% more effective at delaying damage. This means that if your Stagger ordinarily was at 30%, when you looked at your character screen, it's now at 35%, right? So it's just 5% more effective at delaying damage. You also gain up to 15% haste based on your current level of stagger. So remember we were talking about how your stagger amounts can change in color from the green circle icon, which is you're totally fine, you can live through this, to the yellow color circle icon, which is we might be getting a little dangerous here, to the red icon, which is like you could very potentially die from these dots. So your current level of stagger, if you think about it like that, increases your haste up to 15%. So if you're always staying in the green, it's probably not that much of a haste increase, but if you're staying in the yellow, which is pretty recommended, then you have a pretty decent haste increase, and it's nice because again, haste will reduce the cooldown on your brews. So now that we've gone over some of that, let me get in here and start tanking these nerds, and I can show you how all this actually looks. All right, so we will start right here. Let me pull out my little talented exploding keg here. We'll hit everybody with my spinning crane kick, which is now a baseline. I will hit this guy for keg smash, and then I will do a breath of fire on him. You can see he's dealing 5% reduced damage to me, right? That debuff because I hit him with keg smash and then with breath of fire. That's what our AoE stun looks like, you can see. And you see this whole time that I'm tanking these mobs, I just have this passive damage dot that's ticking on me, right? And my health is moving, right? If you saw my other tanking videos, then you know, see how I instantly killed him with the touch of death. I think it's so funny. Anyways, if you saw my other tanking videos, certainly, then you would know that my other tank specs were taking like almost no damage. So part of that, I think, is it just being PTR and the stat adjustment and stuff like that, but it's definitely something to consider, like I said, with the monk tank in general. They just take a lot of damage, right, from this taking dot damage. So again, it's something to keep in mind if you're really looking for a tank that's very self-sufficient and can just do things off by themselves. This is not the dude for you. You do kind of feel like you need somebody, like a healer or whatever, babysitting you. So again, as I said earlier, the stagger dot only lasts for 10 seconds, right? Assuming that you're not taking constant damage, right? So you'll see right now I have no dot on me. My health is back up to full, and I'm just totally okay. Which is why I wanted to point out to you guys earlier when we were talking about purifying brew to not panic just because your health is moving a little bit, right? Like, you don't need to be OCD about it. It's okay. You're going to be fine. Just let yourself take some damage. Let's see if I can get some bigger damage going, and if I can do like a good purifying brew into a celestial guard kind of ability. So let me summon out my ox boy. You see him right there hitting things. So he's going to take 25% of my stagger damage for me. I'm just going to sit here and not do anything and let myself get smacked so that I can take some stagger damage. Alright, so I'm going to purify now, and then I'm going to guard, and you can see the guard is so hilarious. Let me see. Where is it? Where is it? That's my elusive brawler. Oh, it's already gone. I didn't even see how high the shield got, but that's okay. Anyways, you saw that it just like chunked my health way up, which was kind of what I was wanting to show you guys, right? So anyways, I'm just trying to give you guys an idea that, like, yes, you're going to be taking pretty constant damage while you're tanking on the Brewmaster Monk. However, I don't want any of you to feel like that means you have to panic. They're not a weak tank by any means. They're the go-to main tank for raids, frankly, for basically since forever, because of the way they take damage, right? It's basically impossible to get one shot as a Brewmaster Monk, again, because of how stagger works. So they're incredibly highly sought after in raids for that reason, right? A healer isn't having to panic heal me for some, 30,000 damage that I just took or whatever. They don't have to do that. They just have to worry about keeping enough healing over time effects on me that it just does more healing than the dot I'm taking, which is a lot easier for most healers to do. So we already have our Celestial Brew back up. Let me go down here. This is going to be a little chaotic, but I'm just trying to get enough mobs on me that I can show you what the brew looks like. I mean, the Celestial Brew looks like when we've got a pretty decent amount of damage. So let's see if we can make that happen. I'm not sure if they're going to cooperate and follow me or not. Probably not. That's okay. This is good. That's fine. I'll just come over here and stun you. Okay, what are we sitting at here? Not very much. My stagger is a little too effective. Also remember that every time we're hitting, right, our basic rotational abilities, if you guys remember, oh, this little turd's going to start healing. Every time we hit one of our rotational abilities, right, like Blackout Kick and Keg Smash and things like that, we are... Uh-oh. Whoopsie. Okay, well here, there's a big shield for you, I suppose. Celestial Brew absorbs 6k. That's, I guess, a little more than 4k, so that's something. Anyways, just remember that you have rotational abilities that will increase your stagger right from the passive shuffle effect, right? Your Blackout Kick, your Cake Smash, your Spinning Crane Kick, and also remember that if you do get into an emergency situation, you can always Purifying Brew and just straight up remove 50% of the stagger damage that you have ticking on you, right? So those are the things that I'm just really wanting to point out and kind of drive home. I think a lot of people are intimidated by the monk because, you know, they're not like the Death Knight that just can constantly heal themselves. They're not like the Protection Warrior that people feel like just never dies. It's like, well, you know, there's a pro and con for everything, right? And the pros for the warrior is that they can, you know, reduce damage up front and stuff like that, and that's great if they have the cooldowns up to do that. But Prot Warriors and Blood Death Knights alike can very easily be one-shot just running into a, you know, Mythic Plus dungeon and go run into a room where there's a crap ton of mobs. You know, you've seen this on the MDI, I'm sure, where they just die. They just outright die because they didn't have their cooldowns up or whatever. And you just don't have to worry about that same kind of thing happening with the monk, right? The kind of stuff that you're worried about is your stagger dot getting too large that your healer can't sustain you through the ticking damage that you're taking, right? Which is where you use your Purifying Brews, when it's at that sort of point, right? When your dot is so big that your healer's like, oh my Christ, I can't heal you. Then you remove a huge chunk of it, and now you have this enormous Celestial Brew. So, like I said, it's not going to be a tank that everybody likes because, you know, just of the way its toolkit is. But it is very good in raids just because of the way that it staggers damage. So, anyways, this went on a little longer than some of the other guides did, but the Brewmaster Monk is kind of funky, and a lot of people are confused by it, so I wanted to take some extra time to really go over some things. Hopefully I did a decent job at explaining it. I know it can be a little confusing. If you guys are interested in playing on the PTR, you can. Even if you're not subscribed, you can just download the client right from battle.net and hop on and play around. You can create new characters. You can transfer over older characters that you've had and just play around and see some of the changes yourself and see if it's something you might enjoy. So feel free to do that if you want. So with that, I'm going to wrap up the video. In the next one, the next tanking series that we'll be doing, we'll be covering the Guardian Druid, so look for that probably later today. And outside of that, I will see you guys next time. Bye.